We have Vinayak Chatterjee joining us now on how DISCOM losses are remaining a concern. We continue to talk about the privatization merits, the urgency on that front. Vinayak, good morning. Good to have you with us. Now, when they've been trying to address some of those operational issues for a long time, and you've been very vocal in your call for privatization as well. What's perhaps the right path to this, Vinayak? Because while we have been discussing some kind of solutions, we're really not seeing anything on ground. Has there been a change in the way state governments perhaps are looking at this?
Well, I suppose the question is largely directed to the fairly important announcement the last 1 or 2 days about the privatization of distribution, electricity distribution nationally. I presume that is the thrust of your question. Am I right? Because I have some fairly important points to discuss on that. May I go ahead?
Yes. Of course, Vinayak. Please go ahead.
So the Government of India, Power Ministry, issued the draft standard bidding documents for privatization of distribution activities across the nation, both at the regular states as well as the union territories. In my view, this is one of the most important shall we say, steps that the government has announced. While a lot of discussions now is on the farmers' bill, I think the people who are watching economic channels should actually take heart that this is one of the most important reforms that has been unleashed on 2 counts. One, that it gives a very clear message about the revival of PPP as a concept. The fact that it is applied to one of the largest consuming sectors in the country, which is electricity. So the market is going to be as large or bigger than telecom. And the fact that they have issued a document for the privatization, how this thing is going to work. So the government has issued a document for privatization of distribution. And let me talk, give me about 5 minutes, because I think it's important for your viewers to grasp the enormity of this step, as well as the positives and concerns. I think the biggest positive I've already headlined. Interestingly, in all urban areas, the government expects the private sector to own 100% of electricity distribution operations. And in mix of rural and urban areas, it expects 74%. That is a significant handover of the sector, which has largely been 100% state controlled, into private hands. That's an important point. The second point where I would like to compliment the drafters of the bill, which is the Power Ministry and their advisors, is that there is a very good process overview on how the transaction will be moving. For example, the document clearly lays out what the processes will be in pre-transaction activities, pre-transaction handling of processes, transaction stage activities, and the post-transaction activities of settling down. Very clear. It also takes the bull by the horns by saying that unlike the earlier discussions on Air India and some other PSUs, the DISCOMs come with very, very complicated accounts. But the standard bidding document puts forth very clearly that the winning entity will be provided with a clean balance sheet, free of accumulated losses and all unserviceable liabilities. Interestingly, the market is today mixed between what we call the licensing model and the franchising model. And this bidding document clearly recognizes the role that franchisees play and have included them in the eligibility criteria. There are some issues, but we can look at the details later. Then there is obviously a concern with the people who are power generators who have long-term, medium to long-term power purchase agreements called PPAs with the DISCOMs. The document is very clear in its stand that all existing power purchase agreements will be transferred to the new SPV, which will be private sector controlled. There is some flexibility required, but that again is a matter of detail, which I'll come to later. It also, remember, most of the time when private sector is allowed to enter an area dominated by the government, it comes up against what to do with the baggage of overstaffing and people. The document also has a clear glide path on how staff transfer and absorption or disabsorption of staff will happen. Very interestingly, historically, this sector was eligible only to people who had qualifications in electricity generation or obviously in distribution, but there's a very, very limited and small set of players. It enlarges the catchment area of potential bidders by including BOT stroke PPP players in generation and transmission. So therefore, all these points send some very, very strong signals to the market. And I think a lot of investors now are going to go back to their project departments, to their boards, and try and look at how they can enter this vast new segment. It is much larger than many of the things being discussed now, like railway train privatization or certain other issues. It's a vast new market and would mark a major milestone in the economic history of this country. Having said it, let me point out some of the issues that need addressing. In any complicated exercise of this type, even a single entity transaction like Air India has gone through so many, hoops that when you talk about the privatization of electricity distribution across the country, there are obviously some wrinkles to be ironed out. And I think the document and the people who are behind it have also recognized that in the weeks and months ahead, there needs to be a lot of positive engagement and discussion to iron out the wrinkles. So let me speak about a few of the wrinkles that are important. One is that there is the eligibility criteria, while it enlarges the number of players from different sectors like BOT operators, is very, very restrictive in its financial covenants. For example, it asks for a critical net worth of 2,000 crores of the bidding entity, and it asks for 400 crores of internal cash. Now, this is an omnibus eligibility criteria, which to my mind has very little meaning. Take a look. Let me give you an example. The Union Territory of Lakshadweep has a market size of 130 crores of electricity consumption, whereas a large DISCOM in Maharashtra or UP could easily touch 5,000 crores. To have the same financial eligibility criteria of a 2,000 crore net worth for a 130 crore bid or a 5,000 crore bid, to my mind, doesn't make sense. And therefore, the most logical thing to do would be to get an estimate of the size of the SPV and make the financial condition a certain ratio of that. That's point number one. Point number two is that most state governments are today subsidizing electricity. I mean, a state like Madhya Pradesh, for example, gives 90% subsidy to people below a certain consumption level, bottom of the pyramid. Now, you can't have a drastic overnight change by asking a private sector company to just come and clean it all up. There has to be a glide path, a transition path, where for the next 4 or 5 years, the state government gradually brings down its subsidy and its support, which has been happening for the last 4 decades. It can't vanish overnight. Now, this element in the bid document does not seem to have got the attention it deserves. There is also
Okay. Right. Right. Okay. Vinayak, you've given a very, very comprehensive and a beautiful analysis of what this is and how things would move. Now, let's just break it down for our viewers. The way DISCOMs work is that they have PPAs, they buy purchase power and then they distribute it. Some of them are long-term contracts. Some DISCOMs are inefficient. Some DISCOMs do not, have a lot of bijli ki chori or pilferage, if I may use the word. Now, setting up a BOT road was very easy. You had to calculate IRRs, look at NPVs, look at the site and acquire land. Setting up this complex bijli ka mechanism where there is pilferage, there is complexity, there are state agreements, will not be very easy to, in a sense, implement.
Yes. So, is that a question you're asking me?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just saying that I understand the spirit of the reform here. But my follow-up is that all the questions, all the factors which I raised, they are so cumbersome that the intent may be there, but the execution will be so difficult.
Well, yes and no. If you see some of the, after all, Delhi has got privatized. Do you see that the complexity was not managed? I would say that it was managed pretty well. Bombay has for years been running with a private system, so has Ahmedabad, so has Calcutta. And many new areas have also come in recently. I mean, there is Agra, which is with Torrent, and there is the recently one bid in Odisha with Tata Power. We ourselves in FEDCO, which is the Feedback Energy Distribution Company, run areas in Meghalaya and Tripura. there are complexities, but there is a complete understanding with the electricity department and the regulators as to how the complexity will be handled. But what is important in your question is the fact that there will be disputes. And I was just coming to that the bid document as of now there is a certain dark shade of gray in how disputes will be quickly resolved. While they have set out some kind of a roadmap as to what will happen during the transaction management period, the question is if disputes which are bound to happen, as you rightly said, in a very complex sector, need to be resolved very, very quickly. And right now, the private sector, I don't think, has great confidence in the regulatory authorities' speed of decision making, as well as with the appellate authorities, and then from the appellate authority you go to the Supreme Court. So if that is going to be the dispute resolution mechanism, then I'm afraid that the enthusiasm will certainly be muted. And therefore, it is important for the policymakers to, in the next round of discussions on the standard bidding document, is to lay out a very clear dispute resolution, dispute addressal mechanism, which will be quick, will be neutral, will be impartial, and that there genuinely will be a level playing field between government and the private sector. Now, that is an important thing that I was coming to, but I'm happy you raised the point, because that is, to my mind, one of the bigger gray areas in the document. The other element that needs to be taken care of is that the document says that every bidder should be a registered company. Now, please note that some of the biggest electricity utilities in the world are owned by PE funds, pension funds, provident funds, which are not necessarily organized as companies, but are organized as limited partnerships, or are organized as trusts, and are organized under different entities. So it is a restrictive clause to say that only companies should, shall we say, be allowed to bid. And there is a second level of a restriction which says only two people can form a consortium. I personally think that you need not throw open the floodgates, but you should at least make it eligible for a consortium of three, so that there is a technical partner, a financial partner, and an operations and maintenance partner. So that is required. And let me just end my rather long speech, because it's a complicated subject, to say that the condition of lock-in of shares for 10 years is rather restrictive for people who may want to come in as PE funds and others to fund these SPVs. I think there should be a provision for non-important or non-core investors to be allowed to exit if they're financial investors after 5 or 7 years. And the last and most important point is that there is very little drill down on capex. Now, one of the biggest things in electricity distribution, one is to address the operational chori and issues on the ground. The other is to completely upgrade the network. An upgradation of network, which has not been addressed for decades, requires a significant amount of capex. And that capex will ultimately result in the efficiencies coming into the system. But the document is silent on the extent of capex that the person coming in, or the private sector coming in, will bring in. There has to be some normative issues there outlined, as well as how much will the regulator allow the capex in a pass-through into the tariff structure, because the cost of capex is allowed to be passed on to the tariff to the consumer. So it's a very, very big, shall I say, unaddressed area in the document. And the last thing is, it appears that the bidding document is geared towards immediately addressing the government's concerns of starting off with UTs. It needs to recognize, as I said earlier, that it has to, the larger DISCOMs are too big to handle. So there has to be a carve out of smaller areas, maybe comprising of 4, 5 or 6 districts, to enable the complexities to be handled in a much more disaggregated manner. That's all I had to say. I hope I haven't bored your viewers, but this is a very quick overview of the electricity privatization standard bid document. It's creating waves in industry, and for corporate India, it is probably the biggest investment opportunity that is staring at it right now compared to any other sector. But let me stop here.
No, it was beautifully, paved out, because in a sense, by the time we were able to get your thoughts out, trust me, we've got a real 360-degree view analysis. But despite that, I have some questions, Vinayak. And my questions are perhaps not about the policy. My questions are perhaps about what should investors do. Our viewers, they're policymakers, industrialists, and also investors. Now, I distinctly remember a few years ago when the BOT actions were unleashed by the government, you said, Nikunj, I would advise your viewers to go and buy EPC companies. Now, if somebody says, look, I like what Vinayak Chatterjee is saying, his understanding is far deeper in terms of calling it the biggest reform. But how do I make money? Should I buy power utility companies? Should I buy companies like Adani or Calcutta Electric or CSC or Torrent Power, folks who have experience of power distribution? Will they get bigger? Because this frankly is a business in which capex is low, and if you're able to get the model right, I mean, it's a great annuity come operating leverage business.
Look, I don't think it is right now the conditions. See, with existing power companies, I don't have a point of view because they have a history of operations, balance sheet, performance. So let the investor judge for himself or herself. If you are asking my reaction to this opening up opportunity, I would say that it is still too premature. Let the standard bid document now address many of the issues that are being raised. Let the PPP format get thrashed out largely along the lines that the Kelkar committee had recommended, which is that regulation should be independent, the dispute resolution mechanism should be very, very clear, transparent, neutral, and level. Let all these issues get addressed, the issue of capex, etc. So I would say, tell most of your investors, keep an eye on the sector. See which are the companies that have eligibility, which have the competence, which have the professionalism. Keep an eye on them. Keep track of the process. Let the dust settle down, let the bidding process happen, and at that point of time, take a call on some of the listed companies that may have chosen to enter this area. For the time being, it is not an arena for the stock investor, but it is a developing area. That's all I'll say.
Okay, great point, Vinayak. I hope you'll appreciate that what was my essence of my question. Before we follow it up, Vinayak, when a sector changes, there are direct beneficiaries, there are second derivative beneficiaries. It's when the gold rush happened, Levi's got invented. Since you're calling it a big reform, can I say that the real change could happen in power distribution, but along with that, if you're making electricity meter, if you're making transformers, if you're making wires, because if you have to become efficient, yes, you will have to check on pilferage, but you also have to upgrade the infrastructure. Could the electricity distribution upgrade of infrastructure happen now?
Of course. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I would have said it myself. And I have said this earlier in a larger context, that don't look at necessarily the EPC and the BOT players, but look at the second differential of people who supply goods and services to this sector. So you've made a very interesting point. Your investors should keep their eye on any goods and services that enter the electricity distribution space. It could be software companies that will redesign the software programs that will work with smart grids and smart meters. It is the suppliers of smart meters, cables, insulators, transformers, every kind of stuff that goes in, because this is now going to be the biggest market reform that is happening, I suppose, after the shindig on the agricultural stuff settles down. You will see a resurgent action. So it's a very good point. Keep your eye on all those companies that make electricity stocks. And I would probably bet that in about 10 or 12 months from now, you will see a rise in those stocks, but not immediately.
The way you've covered, first you broke the thing down for us, then we spoke about what are the challenges. Thank you for outlining and calling out this. This is a big reform, we should not take it lightly. And then we are wrapping up the discussion with what investors should do. So we had a brilliant and engaging discussion. Thank you very much for your time and thank you for your valuable inputs.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this topic. Thank you. Appreciate it.